German POWs couldn't believe it. When they were captured and shipped across the Atlantic, they expected misery, punishment, even death. After all, the Nazis had told them that Americans were brutal, barbaric, and merciless. But what these German soldiers discovered inside U.S. prisoner of war camps was something so shocking. Many of them would later say they lived better in America as captives than they did as free men in their own homeland. This is the untold story of how German prisoners of war in the United States, over 370,000 of them during World War II, were treated not just fairly, but in many cases generously. A story so unusual it still stuns historians and veterans to this day. It's the summer of 1943. The war has been raging for nearly 4 years. German troops, once the unstoppable force of Hitler's Third Reich, are beginning to falter. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps under the legendary General Erwin Rommel had been defeated. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, battle-hardened men, were captured by the Allies. But here was the problem. Britain was already overflowing with prisoners. Their resources were stretched thin, food was rationed, and the thought of housing tens of thousands of Germans on British soil was not sustainable. So the solution came from across the Atlantic. The United States would take them in. At first, German soldiers thought this was a death sentence. They whispered to each other, "America, we will never return." Rumors circulated that the Americans would starve them, force them into back-breaking labor or worse, line them up against a wall. For many, the boat journey across the Atlantic felt like a one-way trip into darkness. But as the ships pulled into harbors from New York to Virginia, something unexpected awaited them. Thousands of German soldiers, still wearing their dusty Afrika Korps uniforms, marched down the gangplank, their hands bound, their faces grim. They had been told by their officers to resist, to show no weakness, and to expect cruelty. Yet, instead of abuse, American guards gave them water. Some even offered cigarettes. By the time they reached their camps, many of them built in remote areas across the American South, Midwest, and even the desert Southwest, the first shock hit them. These prisoner of war camps looked less like dungeons and more like small towns. Rows of barracks, mess halls, recreational fields, even libraries. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment, but the Americans went further than anyone expected. Prisoners were given 3 meals a day, balanced meals with meat, bread, vegetables, and even dessert. To a soldier who had grown up in wartime Germany, where food shortages were constant, this was almost unbelievable. One German POW later recalled, "We ate better in those camps than our families did back home. For the first time I felt full. But why? Why would America, locked in a brutal war against Nazi Germany, treat its enemy soldiers with such decency? Was this simply kindness, or a calculated strategy?" The answer is far more complex, tied to America's identity, its laws, and even its propaganda war against Hitler. For the Germans, it was nothing short of a revelation. When the German POWs settled into their new reality on American soil, the first thing they noticed was order. The camps weren't chaotic prisons with barbed wire and screaming guards. They were organized, structured, and surprisingly, calm. Across more than 500 POW camps scattered through 46 U.S. states, the layout was almost identical. Rows of barracks, a central dining hall, a small infirmary, and space for work or recreation. The camps were built to hold anywhere from 500 to several thousand prisoners. To the Americans, this was not just about housing captives. It was about maintaining discipline while also upholding international law. But to the Germans, it felt like stepping into another world. For many POWs, the true shock came in the mess hall. They were served hot meals 3 times a day, eggs, bacon, bread, milk, even fresh fruit. The food portions were generous, and they followed the same standards given to American soldiers. For men who had grown up under strict Nazi rationing, where their families back home often survived on thin soup and black bread, the abundance in the camps seemed unreal. Some prisoners later admitted they initially refused the food, convinced it was a trick. But hunger won out, and soon they realized this was real. A former POW wrote in his memoir, "I thought I was dreaming. The Americans gave us butter, meat, even chocolate. Back home, my wife and children stood in line for hours just to get scraps. It wasn't just the food. Many camps had radios and access to American newspapers. Imagine being a young German soldier, fresh off the battlefield, suddenly hearing swing music by Benny Goodman or reading about baseball scores in the morning paper. At first, guards worried that giving POWs access to American culture would embolden them. But what happened instead was fascinating. The prisoners grew curious. They compared the propaganda they had been fed in Germany with the freedom they saw in America. Slowly, cracks began to form in the image of barbaric America painted by the Nazi regime. In some camps, guards organized movie nights. German soldiers sat in rows watching Hollywood films starring Clark Gable or John Wayne. Some laughed, some scoffed, but most were astonished by the sheer scale of American culture. According to the Geneva Convention, POWs could not be forced into dangerous or military-related labor, but they could be employed in agriculture, forestry, and public works. The U.S. quickly realized this was an opportunity. With so many young American men fighting overseas, labor shortages were severe. And so, German POWs found themselves picking cotton in Texas, harvesting wheat in Kansas, or cutting timber in the Pacific Northwest. They were paid in small wages, tokens that could be spent in camp canteens on candy, toiletries, or even musical instruments. Some Germans resisted at first, refusing to work, but many eventually embraced it because it gave them purpose and a taste of normal life. American farmers, initially skeptical about working with their enemies, were often shocked by how polite and hard-working the Germans were. In some cases, lifelong friendships even began. When not working, prisoners had surprising freedoms. Soccer and handball were popular, but many also adopted American pastimes. Baseball diamonds were built in several camps, and Germans learned how to swing a bat and run the bases. Some became so skilled that games between POWs and American guards drew local crowds. Other camps allowed orchestras to form. Classical musicians among the prisoners performed concerts, sometimes even for local American townsfolk. One camp in Georgia became famous for its choir, which performed German hymns at Christmas for both POWs and locals. But underneath this surprising comfort, there were tensions. The camps housed not just ordinary soldiers, but also die-hard Nazis, men fanatically loyal to Hitler. While many POWs were warming to American life, these hardliners were determined to maintain strict Nazi discipline inside the camps. And soon, conflicts between ordinary prisoners and these extremists would shake the very foundation of camp life. For all the comfort and order inside America's POW camps, there was one element that threatened to tear them apart from within: the presence of fanatical Nazis. Among the 370,000 German prisoners shipped to America, not all were equal. Many were young conscripts, farm boys, mechanics, or clerks who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht. But scattered among them were hardened SS officers, Gestapo informants, and die-hard believers in Hitler's ideology. These men refused to accept defeat. To them, surrender was dishonor, and any German who showed respect toward America was a traitor. The U.S. military soon discovered that it wasn't just the guards who enforced discipline, it was the Nazis themselves. Inside the barracks, extremists formed secret camp committees. They spied on fellow prisoners, intimidated those who cooperated with Americans, and even carried out brutal punishments. One of the darkest secrets of these camps was the violence among the prisoners themselves. Several German POWs who openly expressed anti-Nazi views, or who were suspected of being friendly with the Americans, were beaten or even murdered by their fellow captives. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma in 1943, a young prisoner named Johannes Kunze was accused of betraying secrets to U.S. authorities. He was dragged into a barracks, beaten to death by fellow Germans, and his body dumped outside. American investigators were horrified. The men responsible were tried and later executed by hanging. This wasn't an isolated case. From Texas to Nebraska, similar incidents occurred. For many POWs, the greatest danger wasn't from the Americans. It was from their own countrymen. The fanatical prisoners insisted on continuing Nazi rituals inside the wire. They forced fellow POWs to line up for roll calls, give the Hitler salute, and sing German military songs. Some even managed to smuggle in swastika flags made from bedsheets. Guards often turned a blind eye at first, not realizing how deeply the ideology still held sway over these men. But over time, the U.S. military recognized the problem. They began separating true believers from ordinary soldiers, transferring them to high-security camps in places like Louisiana and Arizona. Still, the fear of reprisal lingered. News of these internal Nazi networks eventually leaked out to the American press. Headlines shocked the public. Nazis kill their own in U.S. camps. Many Americans, already angry that POWs were being treated well, demanded harsher measures. Why, they asked, should enemy soldiers be eating steak and playing baseball while U.S. boys were dying overseas? The military walked a tightrope. They needed to follow the Geneva Convention, partly because thousands of American soldiers were also being held in German camps. Mistreating German POWs could bring retaliation against their own men. But at the same time, they couldn't allow Nazi fanatics to turn U.S. soil into miniature Third Reichs. And yet, despite this darkness, something unexpected began to happen. For many of the ordinary German soldiers, those tired of war and disillusioned with Hitler, America became more than just a prison. It became a window into a different life, one that challenged everything they had been taught back home. Soon, the very culture of America, its music, its freedom, even its women, would leave a mark on these men so deep that many would never see their homeland the same way again. While fanatical Nazis worked to keep Hitler's grip alive inside the barbed wire, something else was stirring, something the extremists could not control. For thousands of ordinary German soldiers, the United States itself became a silent teacher. At first, many POWs arrived full of fear. Nazi propaganda had filled their minds with images of America as a land of chaos, where Jewish bankers controlled everything, where workers were oppressed, and where African Americans were lynched daily in the streets. Yet the longer they stayed, the more these myths began to crumble. Inside the camps, meals were often more generous than what German civilians received during the war. POWs were served meat, vegetables, fruit, and even desserts. Some were astonished at seeing so much food wasted in American kitchens. Letters home sometimes described America as a place of unbelievable abundance. One prisoner later recalled, "In Germany, we heard that American workers were starving. In America, we found that even prisoners had better meals than most Germans at home." This abundance became a turning point. For men raised in a nation where rationing and hunger had become daily struggles, America's wealth of resources was overwhelming. Then came culture. At many camps, German soldiers were allowed to hear American music. Swing and jazz, banned under Hitler as degenerate, drifted across the barracks. Some POWs secretly tapped their feet to Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington. Others learned English by listening to Bing Crosby records. Even movies were screened for prisoners, exposing them to American films filled with glamour, humor, and romance. To men hardened by years of war, these glimpses of civilian life struck like lightning. They saw a society where freedom, laughter, and individuality thrived, so different from the rigid conformity of Nazi Germany. Another turning point came through labor. With millions of American men fighting overseas, farms and factories needed workers. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be put to work, so long as they weren't producing weapons. Across the Midwest and South, German soldiers were bussed out daily to pick cotton, harvest wheat, or work in sawmills. Many discovered a strange irony. The Americans trusted them with tools, axes, even trucks. Guards were often minimal. Escape attempts became rare, not because of fear, but because many realized they had no reason to run. Farmers grew fond of the young Germans, sometimes inviting them in for dinner after a long day's work. For the first time, many POWs sat at the same table as American families, something unthinkable in Nazi Germany, where civilians were told the Allies were bloodthirsty monsters. One Iowa farmer's wife later recalled, "They were polite boys, grateful for a warm meal. They looked more like our sons than our enemies." Of course, this didn't sit well with everyone. Some American families, grieving for their own sons killed in Europe, were furious to see German prisoners eating in their homes or playing baseball in the fields. Protests erupted in a few towns. People demanded harsher treatment. But military officials reminded them, if America mistreated POWs, their sons held in German camps would pay the price. And so the policy remained. The Germans were to be treated fairly, sometimes to the frustration of local citizens. Slowly, something profound happened inside the camps. German soldiers began questioning everything they had been taught. Seeing African American guards in uniform, women driving tractors, and ordinary citizens living freely, many realized that Hitler's propaganda had been lies. Some POWs even asked for books on democracy and American history. Lectures were organized, turning parts of the camps into classrooms. What began as simple imprisonment was transforming into something far more powerful, a quiet education in freedom. By the mid-war years, America's POW camps had become battlegrounds of ideology. On one side were the die-hard Nazis, desperate to keep Hitler's control alive behind the wire. On the other were ordinary German soldiers, many weary of the war, curious about America, and increasingly skeptical of Nazi lies. The tension between the two was about to explode. In several camps, secret Nazi cells operated like shadow governments. They had informants, courts, and punishments for anyone deemed disloyal. Prisoners who showed too much friendliness toward Americans risked beatings, or worse. At Camp Aiken in South Carolina, a group of extremists strangled a fellow prisoner who admitted the war was lost. In other camps, men who refused to salute Hitler or who spoke positively of American life were targeted. Fear was constant. But these brutal acts had an unintended effect. They drew the attention of U.S. authorities. The Army realized it was no longer enough to simply house these men. They had to break the Nazi grip from within. The U.S. military responded with a dramatic policy: separation. Hardline Nazis were rounded up and shipped to special segregation camps in remote areas, such as Fort Devens in Massachusetts or Camp Alva in Oklahoma. These places became high-security zones, effectively prisons within prisons. Meanwhile, more moderate POWs, those who rejected Nazi control, were placed in camps with greater freedoms. For many of them, it felt like a breath of fresh air. Finally, they could live without fear of reprisals from fanatics. This strategy was crucial. By isolating extremists, America allowed the majority of German soldiers to see life beyond Hitler's shadow. As the war dragged on, POW labor became even more vital. Some men were allowed to work outside camps under minimal supervision. In rare cases, German POWs even lived with American families while helping on farms. There are stories of German prisoners trusted to drive tractors alone in the fields, only to return at the end of the day. For them, the war was already over. They found dignity in work, respect from locals, and glimpses of a normal life. For many, these experiences marked a turning point. America wasn't just winning the war with tanks and bombers. It was winning hearts and minds through simple acts of humanity. Toward the later years, U.S. authorities took it one step further: re-education programs. Selected camps offered classes in English, literature, democracy, and even journalism. Newspapers were published inside the wire, written by Germans themselves, often critical of Hitler's regime. It was a gamble. Could men who once fought for the Third Reich truly embrace democratic values? For many, the answer was yes. By war's end, thousands of German POWs would carry back to Europe not just memories of imprisonment, but lessons about freedom, equality, and justice. By 1945, the tide had fully turned. America's POW camps had gone from dangerous breeding grounds of Nazi fanaticism to unexpected classrooms of democracy. Yes, there were still clashes, still murders, still shadows of Hitler's ideology. But for the majority, the experience of life in America, its abundance, fairness, and humanity, left an imprint that no propaganda could erase. One German soldier summed it up years later: "In America, we learned what freedom meant. When we returned home, we carried it with us." When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in May 1945, millions of soldiers began their long journey home. For the 370,000 Germans held in America, freedom meant a bittersweet return. Their homeland lay in ruins, cities bombed flat, families shattered, and the Reich they had once served reduced to ashes. And yet these men carried something unexpected back with them: It wasn't stolen goods or bitterness toward their captors. It was something far more powerful, the memory of how they had been treated. Many former POWs would later say that America changed them. In their homeland, they had known hunger, fear, and Nazi control. In America, even as prisoners, they had tasted fairness, abundance, and dignity. When they returned to Germany, they carried these lessons like seeds. Some became teachers, journalists, or politicians in the new West Germany, shaping a society rebuilt on democratic principles. Historians have even argued that the humane treatment of German POWs helped lay the cultural foundation for post-war reconciliation between the two nations. Perhaps the most surprising twist of all came in the decades after the war. Some German veterans returned to visit the very American families they had once worked for on farms. Letters were exchanged, friendships rekindled. A few even emigrated back to the United States, drawn by the life they had glimpsed behind the wire. It is a story almost impossible to imagine. Men who once fought under Hitler, later sitting at the dinner tables of the families of their former enemies, laughing, sharing stories, and building bonds that war had failed to destroy. For America, the decision to treat German POWs fairly was not just a matter of international law. It was a gamble of humanity, and in the end, it paid off in ways no one could have predicted. By showing mercy instead of cruelty, America not only protected its own soldiers held overseas, but also planted the values of democracy into the minds of tens of thousands of young Germans. These men would carry those values home, shaping the course of a new Europe. So while the battlefields of Europe decided the war's outcome, the quiet fields of America may have decided its future. The story of German POWs in America reminds us of something timeless, that sometimes the greatest victories are not won with weapons but with humanity. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold tales of World War II. Hit the like button, share this with friends, and stay tuned, because history is full of secrets waiting to be uncovered.